talking shit and getting clicks. And it's me, Mo 3 times. Me episodes. Let's do it. Let's do it. Little this, you know, a little bit of that. You know, a little bit of that. Let's stop that there. Another yay. And really, regard me, but let's get into it. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Hakeem Jeffries, who is the House Minority Leader for the Democratic Caucus. We're going to be talking about comments that he made in 1992 in an editorial. We'll be talking about counter comments made by Senator Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina. Basically, these comments are regarding Hakeem Jeffries' critique of Black conservatives. But you know I got more. No, I got more. You want it?
I want more. I want more. I want more.
Well, I'm going to give it to you because I have the entire Hakeem Jeffries editorial. I'm going to read it to you. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewind it, and I'm going to take you back to what started all of this. Let me explain. You see, Hakeem Jeffries, who is now the House Minority Leader for the Democratic Caucus, has an uncle who is an educator and was a department head at the College of New York. His name is Leonard Jeffries. Back in the early 90s, Leonard Jeffries was given the Kyrie treatment. Basically, he said some stuff about Jews being involved in the slave trade, and he was lambasted. He was put all over headline news. He was called anti-Semitic, and they were calling for him to be fired from his job. All right, so this is what we're going to do. I'm going to take it from the rootin' to the tootin', and we're going to start with an interview that I think you guys will want to see. All eyes on you, and we are going to watch this interview. I'm going to cut in because there's going to be some things I have to say. And if you're listening to my voice and I don't sound natural, please forgive me. I got the fever of the hay. There's dust everywhere. I might have to take a tissue out. I can't breathe out my left nostril. Hear that? That's what I'm working with, guys. So regard me, rock with me. I want to give you this good information, and all right, so in the inaugural episode of Charlie Rose, that's right, Charlie Me Too'd Rose, and on his Charlie Rose show, the first guest was Leonard Jeffries. I'm going to take you to that interview. This interview takes place in 1991. Now, for my people who are a little longer in the tooth, you're going to remember some things, and I hope that it refreshes your memory and kickstarts your brain on something. For my younger heads, what I want you to do is look at this video, and I want you to compare and contrast. This is your homework. Compare and contrast, everybody. Compare and contrast what's going on with this interview and what Leonard Jeffries is saying, and please try to tie it in to today. The interview basically took place over 30 years ago, all right? But we're going to see some themes that are quite familiar. Rock with me. All right, I'm taking you to the video. I can't believe it. Gotta tell you guys, don't forget, hit the YouTube, the like, the subscribe, the bell, hit all that stuff for me. I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly. Let's get with it.
Welcome to our first broadcast. I'm Charlie Rose. I don't know what it means, but as we begin, the Giants are losing, the Jets are winning, the Mets have a new manager, and the Knicks a new coach. That plus the New York Times now cost 50 cents. A broadcast tonight and every night is about people who make news and ideas that attract our attention. We begin tonight with Professor Leonard Jeffries. Who is he? What is he saying? What does he mean? And who is listening? We begin now with an excerpt from the speech that created the storm that swirls around Professor Leonard Jeffries.
All right, listen up.
Where do you want to start? Do you want to go to Amsterdam? Get a book by Jonathan Israel? on European Jewry in the Age of Mercantilism, 1550
Yeah,
to
there's the book.
1550 to 1750. And there's a picture of the Amsterdam Synagogue, which was the center of slave trading for the Dutch. Amsterdam became a leading port in this period of time for slaving. And it was around this synagogue that the slaving system was established. Now, we're not talking about most Jews. Most Jews were being beat up and down Europe and persecuted for being Jewish. We're talking about rich Jews. We specifically make that distinction.
All right, so you already hear him. He's got this book. It's from Jonathan I. Israel. Let me show Jonathan I. Israel. And he's the author of European Jewry in the Age of Mercantilism, 1550 to 1750.
We're not talking about white folks in general when we talk about oppression. We're talking about the wealthy white folks, the powerful white folks that make.
He is talking about the elite, and not specifically just Jewish elite. He's talking about the elite all over the world. Can you think of, while I have you paused here, can you think of an event that took place not that long ago where there was a high-profile black man being accused of anti-Semitism?
Make the decision. But let's make some decisions, some clarity when we're talking about these things. But the documentation is there. We are now preparing the 10 volumes dealing with the Jewish relationship with the black community in reference to slavery, so we can put it in the school system.
Joining us now is Professor Leonard Jeffries. Welcome to the broadcast.
I'm glad to be here.
This was a 2-hour speech. Albany, July, 20th, 1991?
Yes.
Much has been made of it. Controversy swirls around it.
Too much has been.
In what way?
Well, for the last 3 years, there's been an enormous controversy nationally over changes in the curriculum. And I was asked to become involved in this process in the fall of 1988. And in fact, a letter was sent to me from a committee, a task force put together by the Commissioner of Education that was interested in curricular changes. 4 of us were asked to become involved aiding the task force. Myself dealing with the African American experience, Dr. Hume, Asian scholar from Hunter College, dealing with the Asian American, Dr. Rodriguez Fraticelli dealing with the Latino Puerto Rican, and Professor White dealing with the Native American. The 4 of us independently reviewed over 150 documents from the Department of Education of the State of New York as to whether they really were applicable to our people's experiences. And we all concluded, even though there were significant changes made with the revisions that occurred in '87, the documents did not reflect the global perspective, the worldview of our peoples. And so we submitted our reports. It went to the task force. They added their recommendations. And as a result, in July '89, a report entitled The Curriculum of Inclusion came forth, calling for changes in the curriculum. It was after that occurred that the storm over changes in the curriculum took place, and I was at the center of it.
It does.
Oh, wow. So, guys, right now, what is he talking about? Professor Jeffries is basically saying that, hey, him as well as someone to represent the Hispanic community, the Native American community, and the Asian community all were chosen to come together to create curriculum for a school. And that there was a little bit of, hey, guys, you may not want to teach that. Can you think about an issue today where there's some kind of courses and classes that some conservatives don't want to? And to remind you, Professor Leonard Jeffries is a college professor. He's not at middle school. Let's keep it.
Being used as a red herring or a scapegoat for any changes.
On the question of curriculum changes, the basic thrust that the curriculums in high schools and schools around the state of New York ought to reflect the contribution of African Americans, Africans to this country.
And Asians and Native Americans, and that's what we call for.
That idea,
we haven't called for anything.
That idea
less
gets
than
you
that.
a lot of support. A lot of people are with you on that.
No, they're not.
Well,
People
but wait,
cannot
hold
deal
on one
with
second. Let
the
me take.
seriousness of the African experience in the world and the African American experience. And when they do deal with it, it reflects harshly on the American scene, where you have a Jefferson and a Washington that was more than just founded. They were just more than founders of this nation. They were slave-owning merchants. And when you have to deal with the contradiction of people saying that we are for liberty, justice, and equality, and putting it in their basic documents, and having hundreds of people enslaved, including their own children, and never freeing them, then there's a basic contradiction which is at the heart of this nation.
You'll get a lot of people who may not agree with your political philosophy, but will say to you that the fact that George Washington owned slaves ought to be included in any full perspective on who they were and their contribution to the founding of this country.
There's not a lot. The reaction has been that it's anti-American to raise these issues, and that raising the issues of the centrality of the experience of peoples of color is anti-white.
But that's
been the
not
reaction.
what's created the controversy.
The
Professor
controversy
Jeffrey, the
did
controversy
not occur in July of this year. The controversy has been raging for 3 years.
But it exploded in July of this year when people saw that 2-hour speech and saw...
as a charge exploded in July, but the controversy exploded in its full fervor in April the 20th.
Why do you...
Listen now, people, across several continents.
But what people heard were you saying Jews and singling out Jews.
Because
and that's
the New York
what they
Post
heard.
has been from the very beginning picking out certain things and highlighting them to
heard
create
you and
hysteria.
they felt like you were creating and pointing your finger at Jews. And when other historians like Professor James Kenton of Columbia have said Jews were only peripheral to that, there were a whole lot of people involved. No, let me finish. Involved in slave trade. But when you point your finger at one group of people, it looks like it's anti-Semitic, and that's what it looks like.
Okay,
and he's with you on the curriculum issue, as you know.
Then he ought to be with us on who was involved in the enslavement of African people.
But when you point your finger at people, it looks like you're looking for a scapegoat. It looks like you're looking for a villain. We're looking for truth. And it creates...
We're looking for truth.
Why point out one group of people?
We do not. And let's make that clear. Right. We do not, we have not, we will not. We want to make sure we include the Dutch, the Swede, the Brandenburg Germans, the Spanish, the Portuguese.
You did not mean to point out...
We did not point them out. It was taken out of context.
In the speech that we just saw?
It was taken out of context, as it was in other speeches.
Right, let me read you the transcript. Don't read to me. Let me talk to you.
This is the transcript of these...
Don't read. Let me talk to you, because we can do better if we talk. Help me clear up other things. You're saying you didn't point out Jews with respect to the slave trade.
I want to tell you how we handled this whole question. Here it is right here. I went... May the 16th, 90, after the New York Times article went international, UPAP, 50 major media descended upon me, questioning whether we are saying black people, ICE people, Sun people, whether we are saying Jews were this and Jews were that. Mayor Koch asked me to come down to his office. May the 16th, we did. We brought the books. And this is the transcript of the discussion. And this is how we phrased the question of enslavement.
I'm going to lose time. I'm going to lose time if you read it to explain some other things.
You won't understand what we...
So basically what happened was, before all of this, Leonard Jeffries, in the speech where you saw him hold up the book, The European Jewry in the Age of Mercantilism, 1550 through 1750, when he holds that book up in that speech that I showed in the beginning of the show, it was like on the cable access channel. And basically, somebody was flipping around, probably had insomnia, and saw Leonard Jeffries saying what he said and actually implicating Jews in the African slave trade. They had an issue with that. Afterwards, that channel would be disbanded, for lack of a better word.
We say is we're not talking, we say that everybody was involved in the enslavement of African peoples. The Catholic Church initiated the slave trade in the early 1500s. The Pope apologized in the 1980s for when he went to Africa. The Protestant Reformation was born at the same time, and that the slave trade was being insulated, and it compromised itself on the altar of enslavement. Luther's Reformation began in 1517 and
heard you point out.
And the contract to bring Africans systematically to the African New World occurred at that time. It was the Pope. It was the Spanish throne that agreed to the enslavement.
Professor Jeffries, please don't read anymore. Don't read anymore, so I can.
Much of the merchant banking class was handled by Jews. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of Jews poor in their communities. We're talking about merchants. Merchants have no nationality. Merchants have no religion. Money is their religion.
Why point out their ethnicity?
Of profit making, we are not talking about rabbis. We are not talking about Jewish scholars. We're not talking about Jews who have been struggling to survive. We're talking about people who handle the money. And so when we do, Let's get at the whole question. We're talking about the Danes,
Professor
the Dutch,
Jeffries, let me
the
move
Swedes.
on. I hear you, and I hear you clearly when you're saying.
Well,
you
let's
seem
deal
to-
with
okay.
Skenton,
Okay.
because Skenton said that Jeffrey's scholarship is questionable when he raises the question of who might have been involved. He says he read the work by Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, and he opened it up to the index, and Eric Williams and Capitalism and Slavery
And he did
had
not
no
say Jews
reference,
there.
had no reference. But that's not being scholarly. You don't open up somebody's references and then say that's scholarship. Eric Williams produced many works. This is one from Columbus to Castro. And if you open up and if you look for the index, you'll find several references to the Jewish community's involvement at the level it was with merchants, et cetera, in enslavement. Why is there this complete denial? Why is everybody denial of any involvement of any Jews, of any significance in the slave trade? I cannot understand it. It has to do with some type of mental thinking that
Let me tell you what I think, because
nobody's religion prevented them from being enslaved. Africans were involved in slavery. Arabs were involved. Christians,
they believe that
Jews,
you see
and Gentiles.
you pointing the finger at a time.
Well, people who were involved in the destruction of
finish.
Jewry are pointed.
That's what he's been. That's what Charlie Rose has been repeating this entire thing. Like, people are upset that you called them out. Basically, you point your finger at them. He says, "Hey, yeah, I pointed my finger at them, but I also pointed my finger at these guys, and Africans as well. What's the issue? What is the issue?" It's just frustrating to watch him be asked the same questions about him being anti-Semitic or purposely pointing the finger at Jews or singling Jews out when he's saying, like, "Hey, I'm on your show now." Even if he did, and he's on your show now, he's clarifying, buddy, that's what it is. I understand you got more time for your show, you got to speak, and I understand you got a producer in your ear. I could sure use one in my ear sometimes, especially to tell me to shut up. But I digress. But Charlie Rose is going hard at Leonard Jeffries. And to be clear, Leonard Jeffries was lambasted every major newspaper around America during this time. I think at the end of the day, I think what we have as a people, between you and I, if there's any animosity or any beef, I'm telling you, it's those news people that are boosting this shit. It is. They're instigating.
They chased them all around the world to find out whether they were the people who were involved in the Holocaust of Jews. You mean the Holocaust of Africans that went on for 400 years with 100 million of our people being destroyed? We cannot say that these people were involved and these people were involved on the altar of enslavement, on the altar of making money, on the profiteering that has gone on. We have an obligation to say that 100 million of our ancestors have not been spoken for. Millions of Native American ancestors that are ours have not been spoken for. We have an obligation. If you don't understand that, then no one will ever understand it, because it's been the Jewish community that has pointed the finger at those people who have oppressed them.
Let me raise this question with you. This is a time in this community when we need healing, when we need reconciliation.
Truth will heal.
Let me finish.
A lie will not heal. The lie of white supremacy, the lie that blacks are the victims of their own victimization, and when we raise the question of our oppression, we're dealing with victimology.
Who is articulating that lie?
I like that he stepped on him because now Charlie Rose went to that, we're trying to heal as a community. Listen, I'm going to speak for Leonard Jeffries right now, old professor, right? Motherfuck that. Fuck this healing. We're trying to figure out who we're as a people. Our whole entire identity was stolen. Not only that, you motherfuckers lied about the history. You lied about who did what to us, and you've been saying this in academics and education, which means the best and brightest people of America think that the slave trade merely was Africans trading Africans to Europeans. Not that it was a big-ass conglomeration of intricate networking parts between private financiers, national banks, and governments. They try to just downplay it to like it was like we're selling some cigars or something. Like when you used to get those Cubans by way of Bahamas. Right? I got mad listening to this part. For anybody who wants to know, I was PO'd when he said, like, let's talk about Hill, and everybody gets the Hill except for the black people. And then what Leonard Jeffries says just prior to that is, hey, anytime we try to talk about the American slave trade, we're called un-American. See memes about that, right? America is so racist that anytime you protest racism, it seems like you're protesting America. That meme? We can heal, but we need the truth. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I'm not going to say, hey, you didn't do something, but like this is what happened. We're putting the truth out there. We can discuss it and let's get it through there.
People have said when we raise the question of our enslavement or our degradation, we are dealing with oppression studies, we're dealing with victimology. No one says that when the Jews deal with the Holocaust. When they deal with the Holocaust, that's a sacred mission to raise these questions. When we deal with our Holocaust, we are being oppressive, we're being we're being victimologists. It is wrong. It is incorrect. And that's what the hell has been going on. And we need to get to the bottom of it because we have a mission to get to the truth. We cannot march into the 21st century with this 19th century ideology of white supremacy. And that's the way we feel. And it's not me, it's millions of us across this nation and the world. We are going to get at the truth of our relationship, and the relationship is going to be based upon integrity.
Help me get at the truth then on the number.
It's going to be based upon integrity.
Let me get in.
People have profiteered off of African peoples. They have profiteered off of African peoples.
That's part of the history that we know.
Okay, and everybody has been involved in it.
But don't point the finger. Don't point the finger at
He's not pointing the finger. He just said everybody's been involved in it.
That's what bothers people at a time in when a community needs healing and a community seems to need people who are looking.
I don't know. It seems like to me, like what is so infuriating watching this is that Professor Jeffries is giving a logical argument. Professor Jeffries is trying to have a conversation. Professor Jeffries has some beefs and some gripes, and he wants to get those gripes out on the table. Charlie Rose seems like he's caving for a community that doesn't want this. Not maybe an entire community, maybe some key people in the community that don't even want to bother with this. So there he is, defending a community at the expense of Black Americans.
For a way to bridge the gap between them and look for a need for understanding.
Was every ethnic group involved in the making of Hollywood and the negative images of African peoples? Was every ethnic group involved in the making of the Sambo image, in the making of the Stephen Fletcher?
Yes.
Which was the ethnic group that had a particular interest in that, a particular influence in that? Why can't we get at the truth of that? That's not a defamation of all Jews. It's a defamation of European Jewry that was participating in white supremacy in America.
Say things,
reflecting a
when
culture
you
of white
say
supremacy.
that, Professor Jeffries, there you go. You raise the flag of a whole group of people rather than pointing a question about an individual entrepreneur.
Of our oppression
but broad
and our
brush strokes
degradation
at a time that we need people to reconcile, to speak softly, to communicate, and to somehow find
what? Charlie Rose, to reconcile about what? A lie of white supremacy?
No one's asking you to
reconcile. A lie that we have not been involved in this nation in the building of it?
Let me
a
read
lie
to you
that we are just criminals and dope dealers?
May I read
a lie
to you
that
now?
our families are fractured and we have not participated?
Listen
that we
to
need affirmative action and no one else has had it?
Listen to this. Time magazine in a piece about you said, for long stretches of his speech before an Empire State Black Arts and Cultural Festival last month, Jeffries made an intense and affecting case for blacks to study African history and learn the buried side of their own stories. But he kept veering obsessively back into a snarling racism. Strange to watch the intelligent angels of his nature wrestling with nasty little cretins. The cretins won a few rounds. When you hear that, is that a fair reflection of what happened in that speech?
Have you been around for the last 3 years when I have been attacked up and down America in Time magazine, New York Times? The New York Post has been particularly venomous in this attack. When they paired me with the Commissioner of Education because they're trying to get rid of him. I don't even know the Commissioner of Education.
Venomous?
We only met one.
Venomous?
Yes,
well, the editor of the New York Post will be here.
Okay,
and
well, good, because they have led the attack in an unscrupulous way and tearing.
Yeah, the editor of the New York Post is there. He's going to be in the after show. Who's not going to be there to confront him is Leonard Jeffries because they moved the show on, probably in the green room, grabbing his leather jacket because it's probably freezing now. He got that dashiki on. You gotta have a sheepskin on. He in New York.
Me to the issue generally of anti-Semitism in society today.
The issue is not anti-Semitism. The issue is the multicultural curriculum, and the people who have been arrayed against it have used the flag of anti-Semitism so that the truth, in terms of the human experience, is not going to be a part of the educational process.
People are not raising the flag. People are responding when they see an ethnic group 22 somehow scapegoats and responsible for the plight of others.
When people are tracking down Nazis all over the world, is that pointing a finger at a particular ethnic group?
Are you making an equivalency between Nazis and somebody?
No, Charlie Rose, let me answer for him. He's saying that, hey, he's going to play the part as a black man who is a descendant of African slaves. He is going to be like a Nazi hunter, but instead of hunting Nazis, he's going to hunt people that helped him, people and entities that helped enslave African people and or people who were continuing to participate in the transatlantic slave trade after it was found illegal. After it was made illegal, there were still millions of slaves still bought over when slavery was prohibited, specifically in America, especially in America. So, as what I'm going to do is, hey, this plantation, oh, they got companies now. I'm going to find them. You know what? I'm not going to say that it was all white people who did this injustice to me or my people, to my people. Just like the Nazi hunters didn't go and just grab up regular German citizens that had nothing to do, or that they were also displaced by war, or affected by war in a negative place. Like the citizens that did not know that that there were concentration camps or anything like that. Just like normal people, they didn't go after normal Germans. They went after the people responsible. Leonard Jeffries is saying that, hey, I want to go after the people responsible for this. And Charlie Rose is trying to twist that. And this is some media shit. Because Hakeem Jeffries is going to address this in his 1992 editorial titled Black Conservative Phenomenon. Excuse me. Oh, like I can hear my sinuses whistling. Oh my. I can't see. I can't see. That's my last. That's my last tissue. It's gonna be nasal drip. It's real. All right, let's finish this up.
Saying someone who enslaved my ancestors, someone who enslaved African peoples, was doing the same death and destruction that was done to the Nazis. Okay. And the parallel is there, and if you can't make it, that's the cognitive dissonance we've got to get at. People who destroyed the Native Americans and are living on the Native American lands, that's the same process of white supremacy that the Nazis represent, the Aryan myth of a superior people.
People is one thing,
that's what has to be
but people is one thing.
There's no superiority in terms of the destruction of Jews as opposed to other peoples.
People is one thing, and an ethnic group is another. To speak at one particular group and enlarge whatever you may be saying is a whole nother issue. And that's what, at a time in which we're in conflict in this community, that's what worries people. But let me finish, though. Let me finish. You have influence.
Hold on. This is what came to me. Shame, insults, guilt need to be right. Shame, insults, guilt need to be right. You guys see, huh?
You have influence with young people.
You better have,
and 1,000 young people wait. And therefore,
so have other African scholars, because we've got to heal our people in the death and destruction imposed upon them. Black youth have been defamed across this land. Every time you look at a newspaper or a TV, and the New York Post has taken the lead in taking black youth. We have millions of black youth in this nation, millions in the city, Latin and black youth. And every time you look at the page, there's one being run across as if we have all the crime and all the criminal elements in our community. It is a defamation of our people, and it is clear. It's been led by rags like the New York Times. No matter what the editor of the New York Post and New York Times, no matter what they say, it's clear to us.
That
the defamation of our people has been occurring in the newspapers. That they do not say that just a few black youth or this. They single out all black youth. When they had the Central Park case, all black youth were stigmatized
Central Park 5. Donald Trump ran the full-page ad. Remember that? I believe that was the New York Times.
You should have heard what was going on. And when the people in other situations, like the St. John's case, it was just a case of a woman who happened to be in a situation that she shouldn't have been in.
I'm out of time. Tell me this last point. What do you want to see changed?
We want to deal with the truth. And we've got to get at that truth no matter who it hurts and no matter whose difficulty is caused. We've got to get at the truth in order to move together.
And people who say you're anti-Semitic?
It doesn't make any difference what we are. You can say I'm anti-Catholic because we point up the Catholic Church. You can say I'm anti-this. It doesn't make any difference. You've got to deal with the truth. New and positive relationships for the future have to be based upon the truth. And you can't use anti as an excuse not to face the truth. That's it.
Thank you for joining us on this broadcast.
So really, now on to Hakeem Jeffries. Hakeem Jeffries, The Black Conservative Phenomenon by Hakeem Jeffries. This editorial was penned in 1992, February 21st to be exact. You know, I got the cold, got a little hay fever going on, I got some allergies. Please, I gotta read this thing. I'm gonna read it fast. Just a quick tip. If you don't want to hear me read this all slow, you can bounce a little forward, but I would say hang out with me because it's a nice little editorial by Hakeem Jeffries. It's not a very long read or anything like that. I'm going to get through it. Even if you want the playback button, tap me up to like extra 25%. By all means, what you got to do. All right. So Friday, February 21st, 1992, page 8 of The Silence No More, The Black Conservative Phenomenon, written by Hakeem Jeffries. This has been a recent trend in the black political arena, which I believe threatens to sustain the oppression of the black masses. The phenomenon I refer to is the rise of the black conservative. The most notable indicator of this is the appointment of Justice Clarence Thomas to the United States Supreme Court. Why is this dangerous? Let us first examine an historical analogy. During the period of African enslavement, our ancestors were given the duality of field Negro and the house Negro. Field Negro labored from dawn till dusk and had nothing but contempt for his white master. And most importantly, the majority of black slaves who were field Negroes. So, in contemporary terms, what we would refer to as the masses. The house Negroes didn't labor in the field. They were domestic servants. The house Negro was dressed up and was led to believe that he or she was better than those in the field. Most importantly, the house Negro sought to emulate the white master. This emulation was not designed with the interests of the masses at heart. Rather, the motivating force was personal gain. Titled Token Blacks. Perhaps this is the problem with the black conservative politician of today. Their political agenda is not designed to contribute to the upliftment of their people. These right-wing opportunists espouse the political ideology of the power structure, and in return, they were elevated to positions historically reserved for whites. Or perhaps the current trend is to have a new token black who emulates the white master in thought, instead of a token black who may have divergent ideological thought, but is impotent because of numerical isolation. There are those who may feel that this black conservative may well have the interests of black masses at heart. Their supporters feel that advocating a right-wing agenda and embracing the Republican Party is more effective than opposing the system. This notion is simply unacceptable. Conservative political thought rejects the redistribution of wealth. Conservative political thought shuns social reforms and favors a huge defense industry. Conservative political thought does not advocate civil rights advances and deems affirmative action programs, quota systems, and reverse discrimination. Most importantly, it is conservative political thought which maintains a socio-economic structure in the United States where blacks exist in the lower strata in disproportion. I question if a true champion of racism would affiliate themselves with individuals who seek election by promoting racial stereotypes of blacks. George Bush did this in 1988 with the image of Willie Horton. Jesse Helms did it in 1989 while running against a black senatorial candidate in North Carolina. That's my Tucker Carlson. Of course, there is David Duke, but while running for governor in Louisiana in 1991, he blamed the state's economic problems on welfare mothers, crack babies, and that the radical organization, the NAACP. This is the method of white conservatives. Their tactics should provide you with some insight into where their interests lie. Certainly, It is not with the upliftment of the black race. Clearly, any black alliance with these factions promote no collective ends, only selfish ones. The black conservative buys into the idea of the American dream, the dream in which hard work and perseverance eventually liberate and reap benefits. However, this totally ignores the economic reality of the country's capitalistic system. Capitalism necessitates the perpetuation of a permanent underclass. Capitalism in a racist society means that the underclass will be disproportionately black. The American dream will never be a reality for most blacks living in a racist and capitalist United States. The black conservative strategy for our liberation is lacking. In fact, question whether they believe their own rhetoric. A conservative seeks to maintain an elite business class through the promotion of multinational corporations and the military complex, both serving to sustain the current situation of a minority of the people, owning a majority of the wealth. The economic foundation of conservatism prevents an effective strategy to black liberation, leading me to call into question the true motives of our right-wing brothers and sisters. As far as the white media, perhaps the most frightening aspect of the rise of black conservatives is that their popular acceptance by the predominantly white media. Clarence Thomas, Colin Powell, and Shelby Steele are all hailed as our leaders and pointed to as examples for us to follow. I find it suspect when the white power structure and their propaganda emissaries, the media, tell us who our leaders should be. Do you think that a ruling elite will promote individuals who would seek to dismantle their vice-like grip on power? Of course not. Dr. Leonard Jeffries and Minister Louis Farrakhan have come under intense fire. Where do you think their interests lie? Dr. Jeffries has challenged the existing white supremacist educational system and the long-standing distortion of history. His reward has been a media lynching, complete with character assassinations and inflammatory, erroneous accusations. Clarence Thomas was appointed by George Bush to the highest court in the nation. Colin Powell was appointed by George Bush to lead the military establishment, policemen of the Wall Street bankers. In the words of Cesar Augusto Sandino, where do you think their interests lie? Or black conservative opportunists. The House Negro of slavery era and the black conservative today are both opportunists interested in securing some measure of happiness for themselves within the existing social order. In both cases, the social order has blacks occupying the lowest societal echelon. I think that it is appropriate now to make clear that I am not trying to encourage the restriction of black political thought to one particular ideology. It is my hope that African Americans begin to evaluate critically the merits of the black conservative phenomenon and then assign it its rightful place in the struggle to free persons African descent from oppression. There you go. All right, so the media right now is getting on them because basically he said Dr. Jeffries and Minister Louis Farrakhan, he's referring to his uncle and Louis Farrakhan, Minister Louis Farrakhan, the leader of the Nation of Islam, coming under intense fire. Where do you think their interests lie? Excuse me. Listen, I looked at a slew of headlines. I looked at a lot of headlines that involved Dr. Jeffries' name. New York Post was hypercritical. I didn't see any major media in that time on that subject for the doctor that actually said anything positive.
What you cheering? What you cheering?
All right, but let's keep it a buck. We got to hear from the other side. Let's hear from Tim Scott, who basically called out Hakeem Jeffries for his 1992 editorial.
And you listen to those comments that as inflammatory and as disgusting as they really are, talking about African Americans not being able to think for ourselves. When our leaders suggest that we cannot, it's always heading in the wrong direction. And so one of the things I hope that we'll find along the way is that we'll quit demonizing people who look like us, who disagree with us. And unfortunately, when you see cracks in the Democrat base from the fact that voters are making decisions based on their future, and too often now we're seeing more and more African Americans making the decision to vote either as independents or with the Republican Party, it scares the dickens out of the left. And that's one of the challenges that they're going to face, that their policies are so out of line, out of sync with common sense that they see themselves losing their most important base.
And that's what it is. Is he wrong? Of course the Democrats don't want to lose their base. This is the issue I have, though. This is Hakeem Jeffries in something that was written 30 years, over 30 years ago. This wasn't written in 1992. Let's say De La Soul's album, the one with the plant where it's falling out, the De La Soul is Dead came out. Tupacalypse Now came out, and all this time, like 91 through 92. Tupacalypse Now, Death Certificate by Cube. There was an NWA album. I believe there was a KRS album. There was a Public Enemy album. Black Sheep came out. Del the Funky Homo Sapien came out with an album in 91 or 92. You got to look these up. Look these up because I be knowing sometimes I know my stuff. But then also, let's look at the movies that came out. Strictly Business. So 91, Boys in the Hood comes out. In 92, South Central comes out. With Deuce. Or your Deuces. And then in 93, Minister Society comes out. But in 92, we also got Boomerang. We have Mo Money. We have, what else do we have? Came out we had a lot of black movies came out in 92. But one of the most important movies that came out in 92 for culture, American culture, was Spike Lee's Denzel Washington, Angela Bassett's Malcolm X. (1992), Malcolm X comes out. Boy, I remember these things. I was like maybe 10, but I've always been into the current event. Believe me, I've always been into the current event. And I might have originally watched this actual Charlie Rose interview as a kid, because that's some stuff I would watch as a kid. I would watch something like this. But, I mean, this controversy escapes me. It's not something that was on the forefront of my mind, but I'm pretty sure that I was all over this, reading this in the newspaper as a little kid when this came out in 91. All right, so there we go. Leonard Jeffries was antied. He wanted to speak. He wanted to search for truth. He wanted to figure out what's going on. He wanted to get some answers, and he got antied. Stopped him in his tracks. 30 years later, we have someone named Tim Scott who wants to throw his hat in the ring to be the Republican nominee for the 2024 election, and he's going at Hakeem Jeffries, who is a high-profile congressman from New York. From the 8th District, I believe. I know these things sometimes. Right? And I'm not even from New York. So he's going at Hakeem Jeffries for... Hakeem was what? His 20s? Early 20s? What are we talking about? Maybe going to... Probably wrote this and drove down to Freaknik. Got to see that on Hulu. That's a whole nother conversation. You know what I mean? Probably wrote this and went down to the Freaknik. Obviously, he's going to have his uncle's back. Listen, we just went through the Kyrie episode. Is this kind of not the same thing? Kyrie said something, they threw words in his mouth and then tried to lambast him throughout the media. People got super hyper defensive and went after Kyrie. And I'm not gonna lie, like I had Kyrie's back from the beginning. Kanye, I thought he did it like ridiculously, but Leonard Jeffries is an educator. He came with research. He came with the books. He came with the transcriptions of what he said. So if you said he said something, he could be like, yeah, I didn't say this. And this is where we are. We are talking about basically something that's a political move. Do you disagree? Do you think that black conservatives are really out for themselves? Out for their bag, their bottom line, and they don't really care about the movement? These are questions. These are questions I like to ask. Questions. These are the questions I would like to ask. What do you think about this? Was Leonard Jeffries anti-Semitic? Is Hakeem Jeffries out of bound for his editorial? You remember anything fly from between 91 and 92? Anything that came out that was flying? Low end theory? Yeah, right? So there's just, it looks like we have a lot of reoccurring themes. 30 years ago, we were having the same conversation that we were just having a couple months ago, just having last week, just having yesterday. Still having that conversation where blacks aren't allowed to explore their history, where blacks aren't allowed to say, hey, a group of people, did this to my people. A group of people were involved with doing this to my people. It seems that you can generalize black people when 5 kids are being accused of raping a woman in Central Park. Come on, Central Park 5. You know how big that case was? Did you know that Leonard Jeffries was telling you that not only were those 5 kids on trial, but every black kid in New York City was basically on trial because of that, because how the media hyped it. There's a lot of other stories that we can talk about where the media is complicit in some shit, right? All right, so check this out. Don't leave yet, because you gotta hit like, share, subscribe. But this show is not over. What I'm gonna do right now is a special little treat. I am gonna take it and go overtime, and we are going to watch the rest of this Charlie Rose interview.
We're back. We're going to talk more about Professor Jeffries and what he's had to say. Also, we'll talk about Governor Cuomo and his new plan for New York, a $7 billion plan, and we'll talk about what that means for the city and for the state and for the taxpayers of New York City. Joining me now is Utrice Lead, managing editor of the City Sun, Jerry Nachman, who is the editor of the New York Post, which was mentioned in our recent conversation, and Sam Roberts, urban affairs columnist for the New York Times. Mr. Nachman, welcome to all of you. Good to have you here. First, Professor Jeffries, and where you see him in this community and the impact he's having, and whether those of us, the Post or this broadcast and the New York Times and Time Magazine, by engaging him, are doing some what?
Well, I think he's a living example to test us all in our devotion to the First Amendment. I believe that the First Amendment was specifically invented to protect unpopular speech, without which you wouldn't need a First Amendment. So I think the best thing to do with Leonard Jeffries is let him go. Res ipsa loquitur, as the lawyers say, the thing speaks for itself.
Yeah.
So I don't want him fired. I'm not sure he should be a department chairman. He's had a remarkable academic career, and I say that with some cynicism because his first job with a brand new doctorate was as a tenured full professor, which just doesn't happen in the American Academy.
Because they were creating a new, Black Studies program there at the university at the time.
But I think the best thing to do with Leonard Jeffries is just show it, let people draw their own inferences. The speech, people have accused the media of taking the speech out of context. Here's the context, as you alluded to. Every time an issue came up, he had to go to the Jewish question. Jews in Hollywood, Jews in the slave trade. Diane Ravitch, he referred to as a Texas Jew. He referred to somebody at City College as the head Jew at City College. We hear that 4 or 5 or 6 times, even in a 2-hour speech. And what's that about? Is that about history? Ironically, if I can just finish the point, that's multiculturalism. That's the curriculum of inclusion. And I have no quarrel with him on his curriculum issues. But I think it's tragic that he's now linking people's reaction to that speech to people's opposition to multiculturalism, because I believe they're very separate issues.
Who's listening to him, Patrice? And what kind of impact does he have within the black community?
I very troubled by what Jerry has said. And I think the issue is not constitutional rights to free speech. I think the issue being raised here is whether what he's saying merits academic inquiry and whether it has some authenticity to it that we need to explore. I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that academic pursuits are being glossed over by the right of free speech.
You know, Teresa, real academics don't hold up books and wave them. They write books.
I don't know what real academics do because I don't think you're one, and I don't think I'm one.
No, but
I think in the world
we both went to college, and we both wrote papers, and we read books.
Yes, but our scholarship and our level of scholarship couldn't possibly compare to people who've devoted decades to the pursuit of inquiry into a legitimate area of inquiry. And I think that it is more convenient, perhaps it's sexier to sell papers, to deal with the so-called anti-Semitic content of his speeches and so forth, rather than deal with the salient issue of, is what Dr. Jeffries discussing worthy of serious academic inquiry?
Wouldn't that more likely to be considered seriously if those questions of anti-Semitism weren't there and didn't plague him?
But by whom? And what do we mean by anti-Semitism?
People who feel maligned by them, that's who.
Well, the fact is, and I don't want to sound crude about it, the people who are offended really don't matter. What matters is whether, in the circle of academic inquiry, his ideas have merit. And we have seen...
His ideas with respect to curriculum changes?
No, because they're two separate and different, discrete things, unhinged from each other. The idea here is he has raised a question about the involvement of Jews in slavery. We have understood the involvement of Africans in slavery, the involvement of blacks in slavery, and involvement of other ethnic groups in slavery. What he's saying is that there seems to be a particular sore point about exploring the involvement of Jews in slavery.
Let me just interrupt it, because the point there has to be, and if you listen to people who've written about that time as well, it has to do with singling out and looking at a role that he seems to suggest is much, rather than just being peripheral, as other historians have suggested, seems to indicate that it was pervasive.
But in any case, all the analysis...
And that's the historical inaccuracy, and that's what alarms people.
Really.
It is.
No, in any case, we're discussing the issue as lay people, and we need to have this topic explored at an academic level, and it has not occurred.
Which topic?
The issue of the involvement of anyone in slavery, or slavery.
Sam Roberts.
The implication there is, I think, at least to some extent, maybe Utrice doesn't mean it, is that it hasn't been thoroughly explored at an academic level, including by Dr. Jeffries, despite the fact that he is articulating these theories. I think that, I think that, as Jerry says, it ought to speak for itself, and in fact, his entire speech probably ought to be required viewing for people so that people can draw their own conclusions, not out of context if he is accusing people of that, but looking at the whole speech. And I would also like to see some historical, of course, no one would ever agree on which historians could annotate the speech, some historical research or confirmation or refutation of some of the points. But there's another underlying problem that Utrice raises, and it's a much broader one, and I think it's a fundamental one, and that is that we are too often, and the Jeffries case is perhaps an extreme one, not perhaps, it is an extreme one, we are too often willing to dismiss some of the messengers, whether it's Jeffries or occasionally Al Sharpton in a different category, without looking, A, at the fact that their underlying message, and B, the fact that that message, regardless of whether many people agree with it or not, or think it's fundamentally wrong or not, has a clear resonance among people in a number of parts of the city.
I agree. Yeah, that's a very important point. Well, that's the question that I was asking. Who's listening and why is it resonating?
I agree with Sam. In this case, Leonard Jeffries, I don't find him frightening. I find him fairly silly. I find Utrice's suggestion that there's something seriously academic about his inquiry preposterous. What scares me about Leonard Jeffries is I think a lot of people buy it.
Right.
I think Utrice may, or she may be saying so, but I think a lot of people buy it.
Why do you think they do?
I think there's a certain love of myth right now in our society. The people need their myths. I think it's interesting, and you touched on it, that what Leonard Jeffries does is he tries to condemn a group because some of its members.
Oh, that is clearly not so.
You
I mean, that is
when you-
absolutely not at all
when
the
you're
case.
talking
and I'm
in-
not a card-carrying member of the Leonard Jeffries fan
I understand,
club.
but it's the
I'm saying what is fact. What is fact is that he has raised an issue, and in the black academic world, it is not unusual for people discussing points of view that are deemed to be too impolitic to get marginalized like this.
Well,
and what the
it's
white
not
press has done has marginalized.
It's not marginalized, and it's not race-based.
Does the name Sheikh Anta Diop mean anything to you? For example, does the name mean anything to you?
Could we just stop
But it's the
this
same
VBS
thing.
stuff for a minute?
Jeffries is exactly a latter-day Sheikh Anta Diop,
if I were to say to
and
you,
subjected to the
Yatrice,
same treatment.
because 91% of the people in Rikers Island are of color, I have some reason to fear you individually and that you may commit a crime against me.
But that, in fact, is the position of the state.
Well, but I would be denounced for that. It would be preposterous for me to extrapolate from one statistic some predictor of your behavior.
But here we are, like a bunch of mechanics discussing astrophysics.
But for Leonard Jeffries to keep going back to the Jews.
But what do you know? What do you know, or Sam, or I, or for that matter, Charlie, I don't mean to malign you, but what do we really know about this area of inquiry that he has raised? What kind of scholarship and what kind of intellect do we bring?
Tell me what's gained if Leonard Jeffries is correct, and Jews in the 15th century, before the pogroms, before the Holocaust, before most of them were driven out of Eastern Europe, after they were driven out of Spain, if Leonard Jeffries is correct, and some rich Jews played a role in the 16th century slave trade, tell me what the benefit is to those of us dealing with multicultural curriculum in the latter decade, last decade of the 20th century.
I mean, the latter days of that tells you something right there. That in the latter days of the 20th century, we're still discussing multiculturalism as a first event. No. The idea is that we need
why the Jewish issue is credible.
I'll tell you what the benefit is. The benefit is that we need to understand that it happens to be a jagged truth. It may jar some. It jarred blacks, many Africans, to know that many Africans were involved in the slave trade. But it happens to be something that needs to be understood.
Sam. I'm troubled by the debate because I don't think we're getting to that heart of the issue. The fact that, and Jerry raises that there is, the fact that there is a willingness, maybe all too great a willingness for people to believe in myths. And
the myth in this case is?
Well, what may be a myth or what may not be a myth, but obviously Leonard Jeffries' detractors believe it is, and he insists that it is not, and that is the extent to which Jews or any other group were involved in this slave trade, and the extent to which a whole group should be branded.
I don't think that's where the argument is. I don't think that's
comfortable if this idea of myth were substantiated by people qualified to determine what myth is.
Tell me what the head Jew at City College refers to you.
But listen to this. You take snippets of things, which is the way the New York Post, quote, broke the story. Fred Dicker finding it on a cable channel late at night. But let's talk about what happened. You can't take, he delivered a 2-hour talk to a group of people with particular informational needs, and he suited his style of delivery to that group of people.
What were their
What does that mean?
needs?
Their informational needs primarily were to learn about themselves and to learn about the truth of
What was stylistically apropos in referring to Diane Ravitch as a Texas Jew and referring to a colleague at a university as the head Jew in that university?
If you say somebody is a Texas Jew, what does that mean? Is that some way a malicious thing to say?
In his case, I think it clearly was.
Oh, so it depends on who says what? And,
sure.
Oh, I see. I didn't know that. I didn't know.
Well, sure. I mean, James Watt's career ended that way. Earl Butz's career ended
James Watts was just
way.
stupid.
Al Campanus's career ended that way.
Person.
Jimmy Greek's career ended that way.
Jimmy
so I
would
guess
never
Leonard
win a
Jeffries
prize
is stupid
for
too.
intellect at all.
Let me raise this one last question. How is the voice of Leonard Jeffries viewed within the black community?
I think we ought to go into the black community and find out.
And what do you think we
find?
No, but you know.
What I find is that people want to know about their history. The City Sun, which happens to be
obvious,
an extraordinary black paper, features history every week.
Right.
The third page of our paper features history. It is because it is a unique informational need among black people.
But there's no debate about that, is there?
No
debate about the need to understand your history.
No, well, the need to know it, not understand it, but to know it. Because in the United States of America and in other places that have been colonized, the denial of information about one's culture and one's history is key to oppression.
Is there a need to question a version of history such as Jeffries?
There's a need to question all versions of history, including Jeffries. I don't think for 1 minute he suggests that he is the factotum of history. I think he knows that, and this is what, in fact, I understand him to be asking for, academic inquiry into what it is he said. The reason I asked you about Cheikh Anta Diop, for example, is that he was pilloried. Yeah. He happened to have written seminal works on African civilization, which has, to this day, are being denied by white scholars.
Well, I heard in the green room a moment ago that the pharaohs were probably black as well. I heard that from one of Professor Leonard Jeffries' colleagues. So I infer from that when I hear the Negro spiritual, let my people go when Israel was in Egypt land, we were talking about black Egyptians as holding the Jews.
There is no logic to the quantum leaps you make, Jerry.
Well,
I don't know.
All right, let me look at another newspaper that's not represented here. This is the Village Voice. It says the new anti-Semitism, Jew baiting makes a comeback. Do you see a real alarm here, Sam?
I certainly see an alarm among Jews, yes. And I think there's a real concern that, that they are being singled out. It's fascinating. There was a forum last week sponsored by another paper not represented here today, the Daily News, about race relations. And there was a feeling on the part of the mayor and among others that they were seeking solace in the fact that this was not simply a conflict between blacks and Jews. It was like the old Tom Lehrer song, everyone hates everybody else and there's enough hate to go around. But I think if you look at what happened in Crown Heights, and if you look at what Leonard Jeffries has said in many cases, and not just scholarship, but remarks that I think many people could regard as gratuitous, like his description of Diane Ravitch, then there may well be reason for people to be fearful and concerned.
And what's necessary to...
Well, I dismiss that.
Dismiss it?
I dismiss that altogether.
Why?
Because it simply doesn't have very much merit.
That there is on the part
of
the
community? No, I don't understand that the affirmation of one's history necessarily becomes threatening to people of another group.
If another group is singled out.
What do you mean by singling out?
Do
we now engage in denial of fact, or what do you do?
Let me end this by asking.
Do we now deny the Germans conducted a pogrom because it singles out the Germans?
At Gavin Cato's funeral,
Reverend Sharpton referred to the Hasidim as diamond merchants.
So that's Sharpton.
I understand.
So are you implying that Sharpton speaks universally for all black people?
I think he has a large following. I think it was also interesting that no one denounced it. I think it was interesting that a lot of the media didn't cover it. And since one of the questions here is there black anti-Semitism, and we have some evidence of it, that there was an attempt in Crown Heights to link as co-equal the tragic accidental death of Gavin Cato and the lynching of Yankel Rosenbaum.
But there is a very important link that we need to understand, because there is a contextual history to both those things that put them together.
No, nothing put them together.
Because it does not suit you.
Because a mob ran through the streets and said, kill the Jew.
No, it is not
that really
simple.
Happened.
It is the simplistic problems that we've been having all the time.
You're right. It was
simplistic analysis.
It was very simple.
Crown
a group
Heights
of black
has been a
youths ran through the streets and said, kill the Jew, and stabbed the Hasidic kid to death.
What you're seeing is the end result of a choreographed program to deny certain people their democratic rights in Crown Heights. It is ugly, but it is real.
So for which murder is an appropriate antidote?
No murder is ever an appropriate antidote, but it is the natural outcome.
I have to interrupt this at this time. Thank you very much. We did not talk about Governor Cuomo's plan for New York. Can I get you to come back and do that very soon?
Then we'll go to the metaphysical.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Jerry.